Hello and welcome back. This is ProTaleDev back with another Dungeon Architect video, and unfortunately I wasn't able to record throughout last week, so I just didn't get time to do it. I was interrupted a couple of times and just didn't get to finish it, so I've got a little bit more stuff than usual to cover. Hopefully I can condense it down and get through it as quickly as possible. So to start off with, water consumption is now reduced for population. It was too much water being consumed, and so water has been reduced, as well as food has also been rebalanced as well. So next, water and food production has also been, the time has been reduced because it took too long to produce water and food in general, especially for the water well. At the very beginning, during this tutorial stage, I ended up putting something along the lines of 4 to 8 water wells just to be able to keep up with the water consumption in the very beginning. That was just outrageous. Along with the reduced water consumption that I just mentioned for population, we've also increased the production of our water and food aspects as well. Another thing is that the NPCs will now have no quality on their avoidance. Their pathfinding isn't really that important as long as they follow the path, and so we can have a 0 quality avoidance because as long as it's down the path it doesn't really matter. Another thing is that crystal and gold will be earned from dungeons now, so when they complete a dungeon and come back, before nothing would happen, they wouldn't earn anything that they had, but now crystals will get added. So the second the level loads, the scene loads, it'll get added in from our static script, which is just passing information over from our player controller that's in the other scene. That information is just passed over to our basic crystals, and then it's just reset. And then when they go back into the dungeon, this is all reset straight after. So once they go back in, it can keep track properly. And this is also done for the gold, so we have our gold to add from our static script, our state player controller, and then it just gets added to our overall gold and then gets reset. Another quick mention is that the current rating for individual buildings, so all of these, has also increased a little bit, just to add a bit more to it. Before it was just the rating building, it wasn't times by anything. Now it's times by 3, so general buildings, shops and things will now provide a lot more rating than just the initial 1 that we had. So now going into the next big thing, which is something that I've been working on and never really finished. Something I've mentioned for a long time is that now when you highlight over a building, all of these will actually have a proper description. They'll have the name of the building, as well as all the information necessary to know what it does. So for here for example is guest housing increase, as well as happiness, and then rating as well. And this information wasn't available before. I just never finished doing it. There was other bigger issues I had, but since now that I'm starting to perfect the game, and specifically this part of the game, now I'm trying to get in all the information that was necessary that I skipped over. So just as an example, you can hover over all of these now and they'll all give specific information, from all the way from the shops to the dungeons. All of this extra, even the potential gold that you can earn for 5 to 7, population rating, to food, what type of food, and even production. It actually tells you how long it'll take to produce a specific ore, so 30 seconds or 15 seconds. Right here we got the lumber, 1 wood every 10 seconds. The next thing to show you is that I can just show it right here. Our lumber was actually too big before. A lot of the logs and things were spawning far too large, and they were kind of a little bit too clustered with trees for a lumberyard. And so what I've done is I've added these little trees and then these logs, and nothing seems overbearing with all the trees and everything. It looks like an actual lumberyard. Another thing to mention is that the lumber, as well as all of the mines, I've removed their paths, specifically because the guests never go to any of the production buildings. The production buildings are for you and for you to produce things, and so there was never really any need for the guests to go there, and that's kind of what the paths are there for. So reducing the paths there makes sense. Another thing to mention is that the objectives, specifically the production, has been reduced from 5 necessary buildings to progress to 3, just because 5 is too many. It's too costly and it's just way too many for the tutorial. Now, to show the next thing, what I'm going to do is I'm going to build some paths right here, Let's clear some of this out right here, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to show some of these water buildings. I want to show the new UI for the bars that are shown on top of these buildings, specifically what they look like. You'll also see some of the design changes that I've made for some of these buildings, because they have had some new designs to them. What you'll see is when I click the inspection button, you'll see an icon above them. Now these icons are just to make it easier to see their production rate. So these icons are sort of exactly how the functionality worked before, which is a bar. What we had before was a bar and an icon above it, and the bar would tell you how long it's got. I've sort of condensed it into just a single icon. I think it looks much more condensed, a little bit more simpler. I think it looks a lot better, especially when you're hovering over everything in general, and it gives you a very vague idea of how quickly you've got to wait for. And then of course all you have to do is click the inspection button again just to get rid of it, and I just think this looks a little bit neater. So the next thing that I've worked on is the dungeons, these little ones. So if you click on them, all of this is the same, but you'll see that we got an old ruin entrance. That's the same thing as before. However, what we can now do is, as you can see here, we've removed the deselection. So all the small dungeons had this deselection button to close this off individually. I've decided just to press this one instead, just to deselect all of it, because the chances are once you've saved if you've already got upgraded, you're probably just going to close it off anyway, so there was no point having another deselection button. Now on to the next thing. You'll see that this dungeon is a little bit smaller to try and be more in keeping with the other buildings, their size. We've made a lot of these buildings smaller. In general, all of the buildings are actually a bit smaller, even the farms are smaller. It's very slight, but it makes a huge difference. Right here, this is very, very similar to the design we already had. But if we go to the other dungeons designs, what you'll see here is that we have them in respective to their themes. So the old ruins has the standard one that we've been using, but we've also got these newer designs, which is this one's more like a forest, and this is the lush grotto type, and then we go on this one, and this is the volcanic hollow type. The reason why I've separated them with new designs is because it's a lot easier to tell them apart with their themes. Before, it was very difficult to tell based on just the color of the center. And I haven't actually done the large dungeons yet, but I'm going to redesign these to be much smaller and to be in keeping with the other designs. So this castle on this second one is probably going to go. It's going to be more of a forest. And then this other one here is going to be more volcanic in nature, maybe a spire in the center with the crystal. So with that done, we're going to move on to the very big thing that I worked on, which is a reworking of the dialogue system to be more functional, to be more flexible, and essentially completely redesign it, adding animations. I've also sort of gone away from the audio aspect, because having to re-record the audio each time I want to kind of make changes to dialogue doesn't make sense. Until the dialogue is absolutely finished, I'm not going to record anything for it. I might not even have any audio for it in the end. We'll see. I'm kind of wrestling with that idea, but you did see it a second ago. If I just jump in, you see it's pop up for a second, but after a certain amount of time you'll get our dialogue, which is our advisor Eric. He'll explain the sort of the quests that you've got to do, kind of the scenario, and give you sort of a guide on how to complete it. Now you do have your goals up here, which is 1 out of 3 as well. It's a little bit of a change, and so a lot of these objectives, like the production before, have been altered and edited to be a little bit more reasonable. So you see, like, build some shops to get some gold. I'm only going to do a couple of these just to show it off what you can do. But there is still a little bit of challenge to the beginning. What I'm going to do is I'm going to skip ahead to the objective parts when the dialogue is coming up, just to show it off a little bit. So there we go, I've put down 2 shops, and then we got, we need support from staff, so we're going to need water and food, and this will go down the list of objectives on the right. So if you know the tutorial, you just want to kind of ignore the dialogue, that's completely fine. I know a lot of players don't like dialogue in games, especially wordy dialogue, so it's completely fine to just follow the right as well. But of course you'll miss some information, but I found that playing games like this, you pick up the mechanics naturally over time anyway, so this is just a little helping hand. Another thing to quickly mention as well is that we have new art for the fields. It's kind of hard to see because they're overlapping, but we do have new art styles in general that I actually created myself in paint.net, so that's just a quick mention as well. Oh, and also the camera rotation has been removed, and the zoom has been altered a little bit to be a little bit more specifically spaced. So we've got our water at 10 and our food at 10, so we got the next one. That's also completed on the top right. And then we move on, so it's now asking for a place to stay. Now another thing is you can do these out of order as well, and the dialogue will still trigger for the appropriate dialogue to tell you the next objective from where it is. I've left it as that so that you don't have to stick to the lines of doing one objective after the other. However, this is just a guide, as I mentioned before. So now we're on to the very last one, which is rating, which is probably the hardest objective to get up in general, to increase. And so we're going to have to do a few things. It gives you a few hints, so reducing rating or increasing rating. Of course, I've made some minor changes, but just for the tutorial's sake, this whole section here I've left open as dirt, just for the sake of the tutorial. So essentially what the player can do is just place down a bunch of scenery. Of course, you still need a lot of money to do this, so it will be gradual. I'm able to skip through a lot of this because I've cheated myself some money, but in the general game, you won't be able to just skip through it. You will be able to speed up time though, and speeding up time will help you greatly. It also speeds up if I turn the inspection on. You'll also see that the increase in the time also increases the production as well for food and water, so that's also good as well. So let me just place these 2 down. That should hopefully, 99, almost. So let's put down maybe one more store. One more store will probably do it. Oh, actually, let's just, in general, let's put up a scenery right here on either side, and that should do it. Now, we can also pause the game, and we can look through this dialogue. So I've paused the game right now, and you can see that it's talking about the very next thing we need to do, which is to increase the population. So now we're on a new objectives, 2 out of 3, which is dungeon preppers. And it's going to talk about adding another dungeon into the mix. Now to close it off, you just press play, and it talks about the production, increasing the adding an upgrade, and finally crafting some talents. Now a quick mention that the crafting is not finished. I have some plans for the crafting. I'm actually going to redesign it a little bit because there's not enough room for the information of some of these weapons. I also don't like the materials being on the side, and just generally the UI I don't really like. And it's the same thing for the potions. I don't really like the way I've done this. And so I'm going to redesign it. I also want the player to be able to craft multiple if they have the resources to do so. Now, a quick show of how this actually works, how the dialogue works. Essentially what we have down here in our audio sections is we have these individual trigger scripts. So this controls what exactly is said, and then the information from here is basically passed on to a dialogue manager. So depending on the conversation number, as well as the dialogue and the bools here, this will determine what identity it has for individual conversations and what can and cannot be triggered. So if we just look at it as an example right here, if I just move this over, you'll see that depending on if we haven't completed the first objective like list, the goals, if it's not 5 or over, which is the total objectives you need to complete, and if it's also false, and this is a double check to make sure that it hasn't glitched out or anything, this is just a double check. And then we have if the dialogue is actually available. So if there isn't any other dialogue playing at the time, then we can trigger all of our conversations. So if it's the very first conversation, we don't need to check to see if it's a specific objective complete, because no objective will have been completed yet. So it'll just trigger it, it'll set everything in motion, and it'll determine a bool, so it only triggers once. And then we also have the second conversation, which actually has a objective. So this one asks you to complete to place down 2 shops. This one checks if 2 shops have been completed and that the bool is false, so that it hasn't been triggered yet, and then triggers it. And this basically happens all the way through. So if I just close some of these regions, which I've started using a lot more often to try and organize this, you'll see that we have a bunch of objectives that it goes through. Eventually, when it hits the final conversation, which is conversation 17, and then the bool, once it's triggered the final objectives 4 and checked that it has definitely been completed, it'll trigger the final dialogue, which will prompt you to end the tutorial and move on to an actual scene. So that gets passed on to our dialogue manager, but before I show that, I want to just show this this class with information. All this is doing is holding the name and the sentences, and then we're feeding all of this into our dialogue in general. So what if I go to the manager, where is it? Right here. You'll see that when we pass all that information through with that text and sentence, what happens is it gets feeded into here. So it'll start the dialogue, which creates the box that comes up, so the animation that I've got. It'll feed it into a queue of sentences, which we just saw in that dialogue. It's getting feed into that, as well as the name, and then we make sure it's all cleared when we start. We make sure the dialogue is true, and then we cycle through all of the dialogue. We then read the first sentence within the queue, and then set this to available so that no other ones can play. And then we go through the sentence, and then we display next sentence when it's finished, and then we do that all the way through. So next sentence each time. Every time the next sentence is then clicked through the button of continue on the dialogue, this is triggered, which if it's not the final sentence, it won't end the dialogue and it won't return it. It'll just keep going through the sentence. It'll dequeue them so that the next sentence is shown, and it'll just keep doing that until we've hit the end. It's a really basic system, but it's exactly what I need. I don't need it to be any more complicated than it is. Hopefully this video wasn't too long and I've managed to push it down a bit. The next video I'll be probably going over the finished large dungeon, and very specifically the saving and loading, because at the moment when we go into a dungeon and when we come back out, a lot of things that have been built haven't been saved. Pretty much almost all of it hasn't been saved. I'm able to transfer information over, like the crystals and the gold, but that's just transferring individual integers. We need to be able to save our scene and load it. So this has been ProTaleDev, and I'll see you next time.